The man walked slowly down the street, his shoes worn thin and his coat barely holding back the cold. The wind cut through the city like sharp knives, and each gust reminded him that he had nowhere to go. Hunger had become a constant companion, gnawing at his stomach in a way that no blanket, no coat could fix. His hands were rough and cracked from days of wandering, and his face, once smooth and young, now carried the lines of hardship. He had no family waiting for him, no friends who would notice if he disappeared for a day. He was invisible to the busy city, just another shadow among the crowd. He passed by cafes and restaurants, their warm windows showing steaming cups of coffee, plates filled with food, and people laughing in comfort. Each sight tightened the ache in his stomach. He wanted to turn away, to keep walking and not beg, but the hunger was too strong. It had grown sharper over the last few days, reminding him that survival was no longer about pride, it was about staying alive. At the corner of a busy street, he spotted a small cafe tucked between two taller buildings. The sign above the door swayed slightly in the wind, promising warmth and food. He hesitated. He had learned that many people, when faced with someone in need, preferred to look away. Still, something inside him pushed forward. If he didn't try, he would walk away empty-handed and hungry, and he didn't know how much longer he could bear it. He stepped inside, and the warmth of the cafe hit him immediately. The smell of fresh bread, brewing coffee, and simmering soup filled the air. The chatter of customers, the clatter of dishes, and the soft music in the background all seemed like a distant world compared to the harsh streets he had come from. He tried to make himself small, hoping not to draw attention. He walked toward the counter, keeping his eyes low. The staff noticed him right away. They had seen people like him before, hungry, weary, sometimes desperate. One of the servers frowned slightly, brushing a strand of hair from her face as she assessed him. The man swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I don't have money. But if I could, I can play your piano for a meal." For a moment, the cafe went quiet. The staff exchanged doubtful glances. One of the customers raised an eyebrow and smirked. A beggar asking to play piano for food? It sounded like a story they had heard too many times. Except this man wasn't holding out his hand, he was holding out a promise, one that required skill. The owner, a middle-aged man with a tired face but sharp eyes, stepped closer. "You want to play for food?" he asked cautiously. The man nodded. "Just a meal. I can play." His eyes were honest, tired, and a little desperate. They weren't pleading, they were asking for a chance. That honesty seemed to strike a chord in the owner. With a small sigh, he pointed toward the piano in the corner. "Go on, then. Sit there." The man's heart beat faster as he approached the piano. It was an old, upright model, the keys slightly yellowed with age, the wood polished from years of use. He ran his fingers over the keys once, feeling their smooth surface, and took a deep breath. Around him, the cafe was still customers, curious, some doubtful, some amused. They didn't know what to expect. Then he sat down. At first he hesitated, unsure whether to start with something soft, something simple, or to let his instincts guide him. The hunger in his stomach was still sharp, but now a different kind of emotion flowed through him, a quiet determination. He would play, not for praise, not for recognition, but simply because it was the only thing he could do to survive. His fingers touched the keys lightly at first. One note, then another. The sound was clear, unexpectedly strong, and it immediately caught the attention of everyone in the room. Some customers stopped mid-bite, some raised their heads, and a few whispered to each other. There was a careful, almost nervous quality to the first few notes, as if he were testing the space, testing their patience, and testing his own courage. Then something shifted. The nervousness melted away, replaced by confidence, skill, and emotion. His hands moved across the piano with ease, as though they remembered the instrument better than his own face. The music filled the room, soft at first, then swelling, bending around the tables and chairs, weaving through the conversations and drawing attention away from everything else. The melody was unexpected, complex, beautiful, and alive with feeling. It was not just skill. It was a story in sound, a story of struggle, hope, and survival, People stopped talking. The clatter of cups and spoons faded into silence. Every ear in the cafe tuned in to the music. Even the staff, used to the noise and movement of a busy cafe, found themselves frozen. The man did not speak, did not announce his name, did not make a show. He simply let his fingers tell the story of someone who had walked through hardship, someone who had felt hunger deep in his bones, someone who had lived without comfort but had not lost his spirit. One customer, an older woman, whispered to her companion, "I've never heard anything like this before." Another, a young man with a laptop open, stopped typing and stared at the piano, his mouth slightly open. The music was not just heard, it was felt. Every note seemed to carry the weight of the man's journey, and yet, at the same time, it carried beauty, hope, and a surprising lightness that made the listeners forget their own troubles for a moment. The man's face remained calm, almost solemn, but inside his heart raced. This was the moment that could change everything. He had no home, no money, and no certainty about the future, but here, with his music, he had power. Not power over anyone else, but power to touch people, to connect, and to show that a life of hardship did not mean a life without talent. Without purpose, without meaning, minutes passed like hours, yet no one moved to leave. The music continued, flowing from his fingers in patterns and harmonies that seemed effortless. Some notes were playful, dancing lightly over the keys. Others were deep and soulful, pressing against the chest of anyone listening. It was as if the piano was an extension of him, and he had become an instrument of emotion itself. Finally, he ended the piece. The last note lingered in the air, and for a moment no one breathed. Then came a soft tentative clap. One by one, others joined until the cafe was filled with applause. It was quiet, respectful applause, not the loud, over-the-top reaction of a performance staged for attention. These people had been moved. They had been made to feel something real, something raw, something human. The man slowly stood, bowed his head slightly, and returned to the stool. His hands rested on his lap, and he took a deep breath. He had done what he came to do. He had played not for fame, not for recognition, not even for the meal, but he had played for survival, and in doing so, he had shared a part of himself that few people would ever see. The cafe owner, who had been watching with cautious curiosity, now stepped forward. He placed a plate of warm food in front of the man. "Eat," he said simply. There was no pity in his voice, only respect. And in that moment the man felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: dignity. He nodded in gratitude, picking up the plate and beginning to eat slowly, savoring every bite. As he ate, the customers continued to whisper among themselves. Some were shocked at his skill. Some were inspired by his courage. They had come for coffee, for conversation, and maybe for a quiet lunch, but what they had received instead was a lesson about talent, resilience, and the quiet power of a person who refuses to give up. For the man, the meal was not just food, it was proof that sometimes, when the world closes doors, a simple chance, a small opportunity, can open a path to something greater. And as he ate, he quietly began to plan, thinking about what he could do next, where his music might take him, and how he could survive another day while holding on to the one thing that had always belonged to him, his gift. After the first piece, the man paused and looked around the cafe. The atmosphere had changed completely. What had once been a room filled with idle chatter, clinking cups, and the hum of conversation was now heavy with attention and curiosity. People no longer saw him as a weary stranger begging for a meal. They saw a musician, a storyteller, a person who could command a room with nothing but his talent. It was a transformation that seemed almost magical, as though the piano had unlocked something invisible in him, something that demanded to be seen and heard. Some of the customers whispered to each other, "Where did he learn to play like that?" One asked, eyes wide with astonishment. "He's amazing," another said softly, barely audible over the gentle hum of admiration. Even the staff, who were used to the ordinary routines of a busy cafe, found themselves caught in the spell of the music. The waitress, who had initially been skeptical, now stood silently near the counter, unable to tear her eyes away from his hands. She had never seen someone turn a simple meal into something so extraordinary, and she felt a mix of surprise and admiration that left her speechless. The man, however, did not pause long to notice their reactions. Music had a way of flowing through him, and once he started, it was as if the piano had become a part of him. He leaned forward slightly, his fingers grazing the keys with delicate precision. The notes that emerged were light, almost playful at first, yet they carried a depth that hinted at the hardships he had faced. The melody moved smoothly, flowing in unexpected directions, rising and falling like a river carving through rocks over time. Every pause, every chord seemed intentional, full of meaning beyond the sound itself. As he played, the story of his life unfolded in a language without words. The sharpness of the streets, the hunger that had followed him like a shadow, and the long nights of loneliness were all there in the minor chords. But so too were moments of hope, of brief happiness, of resilience. The cafe had become a small stage, a theater where his emotions performed for everyone present. Patrons who had been focused on their phones, their conversations, or their work now sat motionless, captivated. No one interrupted him. No one laughed or whispered carelessly. The music demanded respect, and everyone gave it freely. An elderly man sitting by the window leaned forward slightly, his cane resting against his knee. He had seen many musicians in his lifetime, but something about this one was different. There was a raw authenticity in the way the man played, a lack of pretense, a pure connection to the music that came from experience, not training or ambition. The elderly man's eyes glistened as he listened, recognizing the story of struggle and endurance that the piano conveyed. He felt a strange sense of kinship, as though he had known this man's hardships in some unspoken way. Meanwhile, the cafe owner, who had originally been skeptical, watched carefully. He had never imagined that someone in such tattered clothing, with nothing to offer but a promise to play, could produce music so profound. The first notes had been impressive, yes, but this was beyond what he expected. The man had talent, yes, but he also had heart. There was a difference between a trained pianist and someone who had lived through hunger, loneliness, and hardship. The experience showed in every chord, in every pause, in every swell of sound that filled the room. The customers themselves began to react in subtle ways. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Some tapped their fingers gently on the tables, not in rhythm but in quiet appreciation. Children who had been fidgeting moments before stopped moving. Their small faces turned toward the piano as if they could understand the story unfolding before them. A young woman, holding a notebook in her lap, had forgotten entirely that she had been writing. Her pen rested in her hand, frozen as her attention was entirely captured. Even the air seemed different. The warm aroma of coffee and pastries, which had once been comforting in a familiar way, now seemed like part of the performance. Every sound, the clink of a spoon, the murmur of breath, the distant noise of the city outside was swallowed by the music, becoming a part of it. The man's playing was no longer just entertainment. It had become a presence, almost tangible, that filled every corner of the cafe. He shifted his style slightly, moving from the lighter, more playful melody to something deeper, more emotional. The chords became slower, heavier, yet smoother, carrying the weight of the nights he had spent wandering streets without food. The cold that had cut through his bones, the rejection he had faced from strangers who looked away when he needed help. Yet, even in this somber part of his performance, there was resilience. The music suggested that despite everything, he had not given up. The listeners felt the complexity of his journey, the pain, the struggle, and the unwavering determination that had brought him here. A waitress quietly brought him another plate of food, placing it beside him. He nodded in thanks but did not pause his playing. His hunger was still there, gnawing, but it was not what defined this moment. The meal was secondary to the music now. It was a symbol, a reward for courage, a sign that he was finally being seen for more than his poverty. Every note he played was a testament to his dignity, his skill, and his ability to rise above circumstances that could have crushed anyone else. One of the customers, a man in a business suit, leaned back in his chair, eyes wide with disbelief. "I can't believe he's real," he murmured to the person next to him. This isn't something you see every day." The young woman with the notebook finally found her voice. "It's like he's telling us a story we didn't even know we wanted to hear," she said softly. Around them, others nodded silently, unable to articulate their feelings, but deeply moved nonetheless. The man's fingers never faltered. He moved through different styles seamlessly, sometimes gentle, sometimes forceful, sometimes tender, sometimes urgent. Each transition was natural, fluid, and seemed to reflect the changing emotions in his own heart. He played not to impress, not to perform for applause, but because the music had always been a part of him. It was his language, his way of communicating when words failed. And now, for the first time in a long while, people were listening, not just hearing, but truly listening. As he played, the cafe itself seemed to transform. The once familiar space became a small concert hall. The walls echoed with the power of the music, and the people who had come in for ordinary coffee or lunch felt something extraordinary instead. Patrons leaned closer to the piano, forgetting their surroundings. Conversations stopped, phones went untouched, and the ordinary sounds of the cafe faded entirely. Every note resonated not just through the room, but through each person present, stirring emotions they hadn't realized they were holding. Even the owner felt a change within himself. He had been skeptical, had assumed the man's plea was just another story, another attempt to beg for food. But now he understood that this man was something rare. Talent and heart had collided in front of him, and he felt a mixture of awe and humility. The plate of food he had offered seemed like a small token, insignificant compared to the gift of music that had just entered his cafe. He realized that sometimes life could surprise you in the smallest, most unexpected ways, and that true genius could appear in the most unlikely of places. As the man's performance continued, the boundaries between performer and audience blurred. People forgot about social differences, status, and wealth. In those moments, they were simply human beings, connected by a shared experience. The man on the piano was no longer a stranger in tattered clothes. He was a conduit of emotion, a storyteller, and an artist whose work transcended circumstance. And for those who had been watching quietly, who had expected nothing more than a meal or a brief distraction, the experience was unforgettable. Finally, he paused again, this time letting the last note linger in the air. Silence filled the room, a quiet acknowledgement of the power that had just been witnessed. For a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly applause began. It started small, tentative, almost shy, but it grew steadily, filling the cafe with the sound of admiration and respect. People stood, clapping sincerely, not because they were asked to, but because they were moved, because they had been touched in a way that words could not express. The man remained seated, letting the applause wash over him. He did not smile broadly, did not bow theatrically. He simply nodded slightly, acknowledging the recognition, yet remaining humble. His eyes, however, carried a quiet joy, a mix of relief and satisfaction. He had shared himself with the world, and the world had responded. He had turned a plea for food into something greater, a moment of beauty, connection, and understanding. In that cafe, on that ordinary day, a moment occurred that would be remembered long after the clatter of dishes and the scent of coffee faded. People would tell the story of the man who sat at the piano for food, whose fingers spoke louder than words, whose music revealed a genius that could not be ignored. And for the man himself, this was more than recognition. It was a reminder that even in the harshest circumstances, talent, courage, and heart could shine, sometimes when least expected, changing lives in ways that were profound and lasting. The applause had barely faded when the man leaned back slightly, closing his eyes as if listening to the echo of the last note in the air. The cafe was still buzzing quietly, but the energy had changed entirely. What had begun as curiosity had turned into genuine admiration. People were no longer simply entertained, they were mesmerized. They had witnessed a talent that transcended ordinary expectation, a talent that felt alive, urgent, and real, The man took a deep breath, steadying himself before beginning another piece. This time he played with a different intensity. Where his previous melody had been gentle and exploratory, this one was bold, sweeping, and commanding. His fingers moved across the keys with ease, each note precise yet flowing, creating layers of sound that felt like a conversation between past and present. The music carried emotion so vivid that some listeners felt tears prick their eyes. Without understanding why, a group of customers sitting near the window leaned in closer. One woman rested her hand on her chest, unable to hide the way her body seemed to respond to the vibrations of the piano. Others stared in stunned silence. No one spoke. No one dared interrupt. It was as though time itself had slowed, letting everyone savor the beauty and power of this unexpected moment. The man's music was no longer background noise, it was the very essence of the room, filling every corner with feeling, color, and life. The cafe owner watched from the counter. A mix of awe and disbelief etched into his features. He had seen many musicians in his life, some formally trained, some talented amateurs, but none like this. The man on the piano seemed to channel something beyond technical skill. He carried the weight of life itself in his music, the kind of depth only experience could create. Every note told a story of struggle, of nights spent hungry and cold, of resilience that had kept him going when the world seemed indifferent. A young man with a sketchbook leaned forward, pencils idle in his hand. He had been drawing quietly, but the music had captured his attention completely. He couldn't sketch or write or do anything else. All he could do was listen. The piece was intricate yet organic, full of twists and turns that reflected the complexity of life itself. It was not just skill, it was genius shaped by hardship, honesty, and heart. The man's hands flew across the keys with effortless grace. Sometimes his fingers danced lightly, producing delicate arpeggios that felt like whispers. At other times, he struck the keys firmly, producing resonant chords that seemed to vibrate through every listener's chest. There was a rhythm to it all, a natural ebb and flow that mirrored human emotion itself. The music was alive, unpredictable, and yet perfectly balanced. It became clear to everyone watching that this was no ordinary performer. Patrons whispered among themselves, sharing astonishment in quiet, reverent tones. "I've never heard anything like this in my life," said one man softly. It's unbelievable." A young woman sitting with her coffee nodded, her eyes wide with wonder. "It feels like he's speaking directly to me," she said. Around them, others felt the same, though none could put it into words. Even the children in the cafe had stopped fidgeting. They sat wide-eyed, their small faces pressed forward, captivated by the man's skill. Some of them tilted their heads, following his hands across the piano keys. There was a sense of awe in the room, a silent recognition that something rare and special was happening. The man had taken what was meant to be a simple exchange of meal for a song and turned it into a profound experience that no one present would ever forget. The man continued to play, and his music seemed to evolve with each passing moment. It became more expressive, more daring. He shifted between emotions effortlessly, conveying hope, sorrow, joy, and longing with each transition. The patrons could feel every note deep in their hearts, as if the music were touching something essential inside them. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, while others leaned forward, hanging on every chord as though trying to absorb every ounce of the genius in front of them. The cafe owner felt a lump in his throat. He had offered a plate of food out of necessity, expecting little in return. And yet here was someone, a stranger, transforming his humble cafe into a concert hall with nothing but raw talent and heart. He realized that true genius did not always announce itself with grandeur or prestige. Sometimes it arrived quietly, humbly, and demanded recognition simply through its brilliance. A soft murmur spread among the customers as the realization sank in. This man, who had come in seeking nothing more than a meal, was extraordinary. The initial skepticism that greeted him melted completely, replaced by admiration and respect. People were witnessing something authentic, something rare, talent so pure that it demanded attention, understanding, and appreciation. It was a moment that reminded everyone present that greatness could appear in the most unexpected places. The man's fingers moved faster now, producing intricate runs that seemed almost impossible. The notes collided and intertwined, forming a tapestry of sound that was at once complex and accessible. Patrons leaned closer, their eyes tracking every motion of his hands, their ears drinking in every nuance. Even the background noise of the café, the clatter of cups, the soft hiss of the espresso machine, the distant murmur of the street outside faded into insignificance. The music had taken over completely, dominating the room in a way that left no space for distraction. It was during this performance that a turning point became clear. The people in the cafe were no longer just spectators, they were participants in an emotional journey. Every chord spoke to shared human experiences: struggle, hope, fear, joy, longing. The music created a connection between the man and his audience, bridging the gap between poverty and privilege, despair and optimism. No one in the room could deny the power of what they were witnessing. A woman in her late 40s, who had been quietly sipping her tea, whispered to the man next to her, "He's not just talented. He's extraordinary. This isn't something you see every day." The man next to her nodded, his eyes fixed on the piano. "It's like he's telling a story without words," he said. "Every note. It's like he's lived every emotion we feel." Around them, others nodded in agreement, their expressions a mixture of awe and deep appreciation. The man on the piano played on, oblivious to the reactions around him. For him, the music was a language, a way to communicate what words could not. He had lived a life of struggle, hardship, and hunger, and music had always been his refuge. Now, in this small cafe, he could express every part of himself freely. The notes were a reflection of his journey, the bitter cold of the streets, the pangs of hunger, the moments of fleeting hope, and the small victories that had kept him moving forward. As the piece reached its climax, the room seemed to hold its breath. Every note struck with intensity, yet carried a sense of balance and grace. Patrons leaned forward instinctively, feeling the music ripple through them like a living thing. Some reached for tissues, moved by the raw emotion, while others simply sat in stunned silence, unable to tear their eyes away from the man and the piano. There was a shared understanding in the room. This was not performance for entertainment. It was a gift, a glimpse into the life and soul of someone who had endured more than most could imagine. Finally, the man allowed the last note to linger, its resonance filling the cafe long after his fingers had left the keys. There was a moment of absolute stillness, a pause so profound it felt almost sacred. Patrons exhaled slowly, as if waking from a dream. The silence spoke louder than any applause could, carrying the weight of emotion that had been built throughout the performance. Everyone present felt something deep and personal, a recognition of genius that could not be ignored. Then came the applause. It started softly, almost tentatively, but grew steadily into something loud and heartfelt. People stood from their seats, clapping sincerely, some wiping tears from their eyes. The man did not smile extravagantly or bow dramatically. He simply nodded, accepting their appreciation with quiet humility. Every clap, every cheer, every murmur of admiration was a validation not just of his talent, but of his resilience, his courage, and the journey that had brought him to that moment. The cafe owner stepped forward, placing another plate of food in front of him. "Eat," he said simply, though the words carried a new meaning. It was no longer just charity, it was recognition of the man's gift, his humanity, and the extraordinary moment he had created. The man nodded in gratitude, picking up the plate and beginning to eat slowly. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of belonging, however small. In a world that had often ignored him, the patrons continued to murmur among themselves. "He's a genius," one said quietly. "I can't believe we just witnessed that." Others nodded, speaking in hushed tones, still processing the experience. They had come for a coffee, for a conversation, for a break from their ordinary lives, and they had been given something far greater. A glimpse of true talent, raw emotion, and human resilience. For the man, the applause and admiration were secondary to the music itself. Yet he could not deny a quiet satisfaction. His gift had been recognized, and in that recognition he found a glimmer of hope. Perhaps it was the beginning of something new. Perhaps this meal, this performance, this moment could be the first step toward a life where he was seen not as a poor man begging for food, but after that day in the cafe, the man found that life began to shift in ways he had never imagined. Word of his extraordinary talent spread quickly. Customers who had witnessed his performance returned to the cafe, telling friends, family, and colleagues about the man who could play the piano like no one they had ever heard. The story carried itself with a kind of quiet urgency, a poor man, hungry and worn, who played music that left everyone in awe. Soon, strangers began arriving, hoping to hear him play and witness the magic for themselves. The man did not seek attention. He had learned long ago that recognition could be fleeting and that the world was often indifferent. Yet he felt a quiet sense of hope whenever he returned to the piano. Each note he played reminded him of who he was, of the resilience that had carried him through hunger, cold nights, and endless struggles. The music was more than skill, it was survival, expression, and connection. He played for the people who came, not knowing who they were or what they might offer, and yet, through the music, they connected in ways that words could never achieve. One afternoon, a woman entered the cafe, her presence quiet but confident. She watched him play for a while, her eyes attentive and thoughtful. She introduced herself after he had finished, speaking with gentle admiration. She was a music teacher, experienced and discerning, and she immediately recognized that the man possessed a rare gift. "You have something extraordinary," she said softly. "Have you ever considered performing in more formal settings? You could inspire many people." The man shook his head. He had never imagined anything beyond the streets and the occasional cafe. His life had been small, constrained by poverty and survival, and the idea of performing for audiences beyond a handful of strangers seemed impossible. Yet there was something about her words, spoken with sincerity and understanding, that planted a seed in his mind. Perhaps his music could go further than he had ever dreamed. Perhaps it could touch more lives than he had imagined possible. The cafe itself became a hub for his talent. People began to come regularly, sometimes paying more than the price of their coffee simply to hear him play. Some left generous tips, insisting that he keep them, while others quietly offered opportunities, a chance to perform at a local concert, a school event, or even a small charity gathering. The man accepted cautiously. He was humble, wary of attention, but he also realized that these opportunities could provide a new path for him, one that went beyond survival and toward something more meaningful. As he played, he began to notice subtle changes in himself. The music that had once been a private refuge now became a bridge. Each performance strengthened his confidence and reminded him of the value of his gift. He no longer felt entirely invisible, a shadow in the streets. Instead, he saw that talent, courage, and resilience could be recognized, and that people would respond to authenticity and heart. Every note he played became an affirmation of his worth, and with it a renewed sense of purpose. One day, the music teacher returned with an invitation. A local charity organization was hosting a small fundraising event and wanted him to perform. He hesitated, unsure whether he could step outside the comfort of the cafe, but the thought of sharing his music with more people was compelling. The woman reassured him, saying, "You have a gift that belongs to the world. People need to hear you." With quiet determination, he agreed. The event was small, held in a modest hall with folding chairs and simple decorations. Yet, when he began to play, the atmosphere transformed completely. Just like in the cafe, the audience fell silent, drawn into the music with complete attention. Patrons leaned forward, children sat still, and adults closed their eyes, feeling every note resonate deep within them. His fingers moved across the piano keys effortlessly, weaving melodies that told stories of struggle, hope, and triumph. After the performance, the applause was overwhelming. People approached him, eager to express their admiration. Some asked questions about his past, his journey, and how he had come to play with such skill. Others offered guidance, advice, and connections to help him expand his opportunities. The man accepted these gestures with gratitude but remained humble. He had never sought fame or recognition. He simply wanted to play, to express, and now to share. Over time, invitations became more frequent. Local radio stations, newspapers, and even small online platforms wanted to share his story. Each opportunity was a new challenge, but also a chance to inspire others. He realized that his life had changed in ways he could not have anticipated when he had first walked into the café, cold and hungry. Music had become a doorway, a bridge from survival to possibility. Despite the growing attention, he remained grounded. He never forgot the café that had given him a chance when no one else would. Every time he returned, he played with the same humility, offering the same honesty in his music. Patrons noticed this consistency, and many said it was what made him even more remarkable. He was not changed by recognition. He was simply using it to create more meaningful experiences for others. His journey also inspired those around him. The staff at the café, once skeptical and wary, now viewed him with admiration and respect. They began to see people in a new light, recognizing the potential that often lies hidden beneath appearances. The patrons, too, learned a lesson about kindness and openness. A simple act of allowing someone a seat at the piano had led to extraordinary outcomes. The story of the man's talent reminded everyone that sometimes the smallest gestures could unlock the greatest potential. As months passed, the man became more comfortable with performing in public. He discovered that music was not just a personal escape, but a means to connect, inspire, and heal. He played at schools, small theaters, community events, and charity gatherings, each time touching people in ways that words could not. His reputation grew quietly but steadily, carried by genuine admiration rather than hype. People were drawn to him not just for his skill, but for the sincerity and humanity that radiated through his music. One evening, after a long day of performances, he returned to the café. It was quieter than usual, the soft hum of conversation and the smell of coffee welcoming him back like an old friend. He sat at the piano, and without hesitation he began to play. The music was reflective, contemplative, filled with the emotions of his journey, the hunger, the struggle, the hope, and the small triumphs along the way. Customers listened quietly, some smiling, some moved to tears, all feeling the authenticity and depth that had become his signature. As he played, he realized how far he had come. From a man wandering the streets, hungry and overlooked, to a musician touching lives, sharing stories and inspiring others, he had traveled a path that had once seemed impossible. And yet, he understood that his journey was far from over. Every performance, every opportunity, every connection was a step forward. The world had shown him kindness, recognition, and belief, and in return, he offered his music, his heart, and his story. In those quiet moments at the piano, he also understood the power of hope. A simple chance, extended with trust and openness, could change the trajectory of a life. People who had doubted him, ignored him, or overlooked him had no idea of the talent that lay beneath the surface. And yet, one small opportunity, a plate of food in exchange for a song, had led to a journey that reshaped his future. It was a reminder that potential exists everywhere, often unseen, waiting for someone to notice, believe, and give it a chance. The man's story continued to spread. Newspapers, online stories, and word of mouth shared his journey with more people, each account highlighting the remarkable combination of talent, humility, and perseverance. People were inspired not just by his music, but by his character. He remained humble, grounded, and focused on what truly mattered, sharing his gift, connecting with others, and living with dignity despite the hardships he had faced. Through it all, the man never lost sight of the lessons he had learned on the streets and in the café. He understood hunger, struggle, and the fragility of hope, and he carried these experiences into every note he played. His music became a bridge not only to audiences, but also to a deeper understanding of life's challenges and possibilities. He knew that talent alone was not enough. It was heart, resilience, and authenticity that made the difference. By the end of Part 4, the man had moved from surviving to thriving. He had discovered that his music could open doors, create opportunities, and touch hearts. Recognition and respect followed, but more importantly, he had found purpose, connection, and a sense of belonging in a world that had once overlooked him. His journey was proof that talent combined with courage, humility, and persistence could create extraordinary outcomes, even from the most unlikely beginnings. The man's life had changed in ways he could never have imagined. From wandering the streets, cold and hungry, to becoming a musician whose talent touched the hearts of strangers, he had traveled a journey few could have predicted. Yet, despite his growing recognition, he remained humble, aware of the fragile balance between success and survival. He had learned that life could change in an instant, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, and that gratitude and persistence were the only constants that truly mattered. By now, people in the city had heard his story. News outlets, social media posts, and word of mouth carried tales of the man who once came to a cafe for a meal and instead revealed a genius that left everyone speechless. Invitations began to pour in from small community events to charity gatherings, and even from concert organizers who wanted to share his music with larger audiences. He accepted cautiously, aware of the need to stay grounded, but also excited by the possibility of touching more lives with his gift. Each performance became an experience unlike any other. Unlike musicians who performed for applause or accolades, he played from the heart. Each note carried a story, a fragment of his journey, a reflection of the struggles he had endured and the small victories that had carried him forward. Listeners felt his sincerity, and that connection made the performances unforgettable. People came not just to hear music, but to experience emotion, resilience, and the raw power of authenticity. One evening, he was invited to perform at a large charity concert. The venue was unfamiliar, grander than anything he had experienced before, with rows of chairs, bright lights, and an audience that included people who had never heard his story. He felt nervous, a rare emotion for him, but he reminded himself that the music had always been his voice, the way he communicated when words failed. Sitting at the piano, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let his hands tell the story he had lived. The audience fell silent the moment he played the first note. His fingers moved effortlessly, creating melodies that ranged from gentle and reflective to bold and commanding. The music carried emotion so vivid that it seemed to touch every heart in the room. Some audience members closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others sat in awe, leaning forward as if trying to absorb every nuance of the performance. Children, too, were captivated, their small faces full of wonder and admiration. What made this performance extraordinary was not just technical skill, it was the honesty in his playing. Every note was imbued with the weight of experience, the kind that only life itself could teach. Hunger, struggle, loneliness, hope, resilience, all of it flowed through the music. People could feel the story, even without knowing his past. It was a reminder that true art comes not from perfection alone, but from lived experience, from heart, and from the courage to share it openly. As the concert progressed, he noticed the audience reacting in ways that reminded him of his first day in the cafe. Some were visibly moved, some whispered softly to companions, and some simply sat still, lost in the music. It was a humbling experience for him, realizing that what he had once thought of as mere survival had grown into something far greater. The music that had been his lifeline was now touching the lives of strangers in profound ways. After the concert, people approached him with admiration, gratitude, and curiosity. Some asked how he had learned to play, how he had survived on the streets, and what inspired him to keep going. Others offered opportunities, guidance, or simply words of encouragement. The man accepted their gestures with quiet humility, understanding that recognition was not the goal. The music was. Yet he also realized that with each performance, each connection, he was building a future that had once seemed impossible. Despite his growing fame, he never forgot the cafe where it all began. It was there that someone had given him a chance when others turned away. It was there that a simple act of trust and generosity had sparked a journey that reshaped his life. Whenever he returned, he played with the same care and sincerity, offering his music to the patrons who had once been his first audience. The cafe remained a sanctuary, a reminder of where he had started, and a place where he could continue to touch hearts in the most personal way. The man's story also inspired those around him in unexpected ways. Staff at the cafe learned to see people differently. recognizing that everyone has potential that may not be immediately visible. Customers, too, became more aware of the power of kindness, openness, and the importance of giving people a chance. A single act allowing someone to sit at a piano in exchange for a meal had grown into a ripple effect, touching the lives of countless others. It was a reminder that small gestures can lead to extraordinary outcomes. Over time, the man realized that his music could do more than entertain. It could inspire change. He began to perform at schools, community centers, and charity events, sharing his story alongside his music. He spoke gently about resilience, hope, and the importance of pursuing one's gifts, no matter how difficult life may seem. Young people who had never imagined a future beyond their struggles found encouragement in his words. Adults who had grown weary of challenges felt renewed inspiration. His music became a bridge between generations, communities, and experiences. Yet through all of this, he remained grounded. Fame and recognition had not changed who he was. He still remembered the nights of hunger, the cold streets, and the uncertainty of survival. That memory kept him humble, kind, and connected to the reality from which he had come. Every performance was a tribute to that journey, a reminder that life's challenges could be transformed into beauty through determination. Heart and talent. As the years passed, the man's life stabilized in ways he had never thought possible. He found a modest apartment, a safe place where he could rest and practice. He continued to perform regularly, sometimes for large audiences, sometimes in small intimate settings, but each performance carried the same authenticity and passion. He used his growing influence to help others in need, supporting programs for underprivileged youth, providing opportunities for aspiring musicians, and sharing his story as a source of hope. Despite all the attention and praise, he remained focused on the simple joys. Playing the piano, connecting with audiences, and seeing the impact of his music brought him happiness far beyond material wealth. He understood that true fulfillment came not from recognition alone, but from using his gift to touch lives, to bring light to others, and to honor the journey that had brought him from hunger to hope. One quiet evening, he returned to the cafe where it all began. The familiar warmth of the room, the smell of coffee and pastries, and the soft hum of conversation welcomed him like an old friend. He sat at the piano, fingers poised over the keys, and began to play. The music was reflective, gentle, and full of gratitude. It carried all the experiences of his life, the struggles, the triumphs, the kindness he had received, and the hope he now held. Patrons listened quietly, some moved to tears, some smiling softly, all feeling the depth of emotion in every note. In that moment, he understood the full circle of his journey. From a man wandering the streets, seeking only a meal, to a musician whose talent had touched countless lives, he had grown not just in skill, but in heart and purpose. The music that had once been his refuge had become a bridge to the world, allowing him to connect, inspire, and give hope. And through it all he remained the same humble, sincere man, grateful for every opportunity and every listener who had believed in him. By the end of that evening, the cafe was filled with applause, quiet and heartfelt. People knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would stay with them long after they left. The man smiled softly, not for himself, but for the gift he had been able to share. His journey had taught him that life's hardships could be transformed into beauty, that talent combined with courage and kindness could open doors, and that hope, even in the smallest forms, could change the world. And so the man continued his journey, playing wherever he could, sharing his story, and touching lives with every note. His life had been forever changed by a simple act of generosity, a plate of food, and a chance to play. In return, he gave the world something far greater: music, heart, and a reminder that even in the most unlikely circumstances, genius, resilience, and hope can shine brightly.